I need to tell you something. What I am about to share happened to me just 8 days ago, and I know it's going to sound utterly impossible, perhaps even delusional. But I swear on everything I hold sacred, on my life and the very soul within me, that every single word is the unvarnished truth. Picture this. It's midnight in New Mexico. I'm sitting utterly alone on a cold stone bench in the garden of an ancient monastery, a place steeped in centuries of prayer and silence. The sky above is a velvet canvas punctured by a million pinpricks of diamond-like starlight, but I see none of it. My world has collapsed inward. I am completely, devastatingly broken. This moment of desolation was the culmination of a lifetime spent as a Christian, a lifetime I had just realized was built on a fundamental, soul-crushing misunderstanding. I had been trying to please God in all the wrong ways, climbing a ladder I had built myself, only to find it was leaning against the wrong wall. It was in that abyss of spiritual despair, in the profound silence of the high desert, that the Father appeared beside me, not in a clap of thunder or a blinding light, but as gently and naturally as the cool night breeze. And in the moments that followed, he revealed the shocking, revolutionary truth about what actually pleases him most. His answer didn't just tweak my understanding, it detonated it. It will revolutionize everything you think you know about serving God. What he showed me didn't just change my perspective on pleasing him, it completely shattered every single religious assumption I had ever constructed, every brick of performance and duty I had painstakingly laid in the fortress of my faith. In their place, he gave me the keys to a relationship with him that is more intimate, more joyful, and more freeing than I had ever dared to imagine possible. But before I delve into the heart of my story, I feel a need to connect with you, the person listening to this right now. Please let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. In sharing something this vulnerable, I just want to know that I'm not alone in the dark. And if what you hear resonates with the deep places of your heart, if you feel a stirring in your spirit, consider subscribing. It may seem like a small thing, but it gives me the courage and strength to continue speaking my truth, no matter how unbelievable it may sound. Now, let's begin. I'm recording this from a sterile, anonymous hotel room in Santa Fe. I originally came to this beautiful, sun-drenched city for what I had planned as a quiet spiritual retreat. It was meant to be a time to disconnect, to recharge, to find some clarity amidst the pressures of my life and work. It turned into the most mind-blowing, paradigm-shattering encounter with divine truth I have ever experienced. The clock on the nightstand glows with the unforgiving numbers 4:15 a.m. After the most spiritually and emotionally transformative week of my entire existence, I should be utterly exhausted, deep in a sleep of peaceful resolution. But I can't sleep. I am electrified, my mind racing, my heart overflowing. What God revealed to me in that desert garden about what truly pleases him has completely and irrevocably revolutionized my understanding of Christianity, of worship, of prayer, and of what it fundamentally means to live a life that brings him genuine joy. To understand the magnitude of that revelation, you must first understand the spiritual crisis that brought me to my breaking point. For 6 years, I have had the incredible, daunting privilege of portraying Jesus. For countless more years before that, I have been a devoted Christian. And for all that time, I had been operating under the illusion of deep spiritual maturity. My life was a checklist of righteous activities. I prayed daily, my sessions often feeling more like progress reports to a demanding supervisor. I studied scripture extensively, poring over texts as if cramming for a final exam I could never quite pass. I served actively in ministry, gave generously to my church and charities, lived a morally upright life, and tried with every fiber of my being to represent Christ well in every single thing I did. By all external measures, I was the model Christian. I was the kind of believer that other Christians might look up to, someone who seemed to have it all together. But 10 days ago, I had a conversation that took a sledgehammer to that carefully constructed facade. I was having lunch with Father Miguel Rodriguez, a 7-8-year-old priest with eyes that held the wisdom and sorrow of the world. He had ministered for over 5 decades in some of the most impoverished and forgotten communities in Latin America. He had seen the chosen and had expressed a desire to meet me, a request that humbled me deeply. Our conversation, however, quickly moved beyond the pleasantries about the show and into the deep, turbulent waters of faith and the inner spiritual life. "Jonathan," he said, his voice a gentle rasp, but his words carrying the precise, incisive quality that comes only from decades of pastoral care. You speak so beautifully about God's love and His grace. It is evident you believe it in your mind." He paused, his gaze kind but unwavering. "But there is something in your eyes, my son. A shadow. You are carrying a weight that grace is supposed to remove. Tell me honestly, do you truly feel like God is pleased with you?" The question wasn't just a question. It was an arrow that flew past all my defenses and struck the very core of my being. It was a punch to the gut that left me breathless, because it exposed the one thing I had been desperately trying to hide even from myself. Despite all my spiritual activities, despite the incredible success of representing Christ on a global stage, despite the countless messages I received about the positive impact my work was having on people's faith, I lived with a constant, low-grade, gnawing anxiety about whether I was doing enough. Was I being enough to please God? I try to please Him," I replied, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. I chose them carefully, constructing a defense. I pray. I study. I serve. I try my best to live righteously. I can only hope He is pleased with my efforts. Father Miguel offered a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile of infinite sadness, the kind a doctor gives when delivering a difficult diagnosis. "My son," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you have just revealed the very heart of the problem. You are trying to please God through your efforts, rather than resting in the understanding of what actually brings Him joy." After 50 years of listening to the souls of men and women, I can tell you this: most Christians are exhausting themselves, running on a treadmill of performance, trying to please a God who is already utterly delighted with them for completely different reasons than they could ever imagine. That conversation haunted me. It followed me from the cafe, into my car, back to the film set. His words echoed in the quiet moments, replaying in my mind like a song I couldn't get out of my head. I began to examine my spiritual life with a new, terrifyingly honest lens, and what I saw horrified me. Almost everything I did, every prayer, every act of service, was motivated by some level of performance anxiety. My prayers, as I'd admitted, felt like reports to a demanding, inscrutable boss. My scripture study felt like cramming for a celestial final taught by a difficult, unpleasable teacher. My service felt like unpaid overtime for an employer I was perpetually trying to impress, hoping for a promotion I could never seem to secure. Even my portrayal of Jesus, the greatest honor of my life, was tainted. It carried the crushing weight of trying to prove my worthiness to represent Him, to earn the right to speak His words. I had been living a life defined by what I now recognized as spiritual performance anxiety, a constant, pervasive fear that I wasn't doing enough, being enough, or growing enough to maintain God's approval. Every spiritual discipline, every act of devotion felt like a desperate attempt to earn what my intellect knew was supposed to be a free gift. Grace was a concept I could articulate beautifully, but it was not a reality I was living in. The breaking point, the moment the dam of my composure finally cracked, came during a particularly challenging week of filming. We were shooting the scenes where Jesus speaks of rest. I stood there, in costume, delivering lines about His yoke being easy and His burden being light. I spoke His beautiful, liberating words, inviting all who are weary and heavy laden to come to Him for rest. As I spoke those words, looking into the eyes of my fellow actors, I felt like the biggest, most contemptible hypocrite in the history of Christian entertainment. My own spiritual life felt anything but restful. My yoke was heavy, my burden crushing, and it was a burden I had placed on myself. That night, alone in my trailer, the facade shattered completely. I had what can only be described as a full-scale spiritual breakdown. It wasn't a crisis of faith in God's existence or His love. I never doubted that. It was a breakdown born of complete and utter confusion regarding what He actually wanted from me. I felt like I had been playing a complex, cosmic game my entire Christian life without ever understanding the rules. I was desperately trying to win an approval that might already be mine, but I was using methods that might be entirely tragically wrong. "God," I prayed, my voice a choked whisper in the suffocating silence of the trailer. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm pleasing You or disappointing You. I don't know if any of my efforts matter or if I'm missing the entire point. I have been a Christian for decades. I've portrayed Your Son, and I feel like I don't understand the first, most basic thing about what actually brings You joy." 3 days later, fueled by desperation, I made an impulsive decision. I called Dallas, told him I needed a week, and without a concrete plan, I got in my car and started driving. I drove east, towards New Mexico, towards a solo retreat at a monastery I'd heard whispers about but had never visited, the Monastery of Christ in the Desert. Something deep within my spirit was crying out, screaming for clarity, for a fundamental realignment of my relationship with God. I needed space, I needed silence, and I needed to hear his voice without the deafening noise of ministry obligations, production schedules, and public expectations. The Monastery of Christ in the Desert was precisely what my soul craved. It was an ancient place of prayer, a sanctuary of adobe and silence nestled deep in the Chama Canyon, a rugged high desert landscape that felt both harsh and holy. Benedictine monks had been seeking God in this solitude for decades, their lives a quiet testament to a different rhythm. The moment I arrived, stepping out of my car into the crisp, pinyon-scented air, I felt as if I had stepped into a different spiritual atmosphere. It was a place where performance anxiety had no oxygen, and where genuine, desperate seeking was welcomed. For 3 days, I immersed myself in the monastery's ancient rhythm. Prayer, work, study, silence. I attended the Liturgy of the Hours, chanting psalms with the monks in the cool, candlelit chapel. I hoped that these ancient practices, this sacred routine, would bring clarity to my very modern confusion. But instead of the peace I so desperately sought, I felt increasingly agitated. My inability to grasp what God actually wanted from me felt more acute in this holy place. The monks spoke of seeking God's pleasure through contemplation, through submission to his will, through the surrender of personal desires. But even their profound wisdom felt like more instructions to follow, more spiritual hurdles to clear, more ways to try to please God through effort and discipline. I deeply appreciated their sincerity and their devotion, but I left each conversation feeling more lost, more confused about the fundamental question that plagued me. What does God actually enjoy about his relationship with his children? On my 4th night at the monastery, sleep was an impossibility. My mind was a whirlwind of anxiety and unanswered questions. At around 11:30 p.m., I left the Spartan simplicity of my guest room and wandered into the monastery garden. It was a beautiful, contemplative space, filled with resilient desert plants and walking paths designed for meditation. The New Mexico sky was a revelation. It was breathtaking, a celestial dome packed with more stars than I had ever seen in my life, unobscured by city lights. The silence was absolute, profound, broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. I found a simple stone bench in the center of the garden and sat down, feeling utterly overwhelmed by the vastness of the cosmos above me and the smallness, the poverty of my own understanding. Here I was, a man who had portrayed Jesus for 6 years, a man who had, by God's grace, influenced the faith of millions, a man who had studied theology and spirituality with diligence, and I felt like I knew absolutely nothing about the most basic aspect of faith. What brings God joy? Father, I said aloud to the star-filled sky, my voice sounding small and fragile in the immense quiet. I didn't care if any of the monks might hear me. My desperation had eclipsed my self-consciousness. I need you to tell me the truth, the real truth about what pleases you, not what the church says pleases you, not what theology books and pastors say pleases you, not what I think should please you. I need to know what actually, truly brings you joy. The desert held its breath. The only reply was the distant, lonely call of a coyote, a wild and mournful sound echoing in the darkness. I felt like I was sitting at the precise intersection of utter desperation and fragile hope, finally stripped bare of all my pretenses, ready to hear a truth that might shatter everything I thought I knew. I have spent my entire Christian life trying to please you, I continued, the confession pouring out of me. Through my behavior, my service, my spiritual disciplines, my moral choices, but I don't know if any of it actually matters to you in the way I think it does. I don't know if I'm missing something fundamental, something core, about what you're actually looking for in a relationship with your children. The silence that followed this plea felt different from the ordinary quiet of the desert night. It was a charged silence, pregnant with possibility, like the moment before dawn when the darkness is at its deepest, just about to give way to light. I had moved beyond asking for help or guidance. I was now questioning the very foundation of my understanding of God's desires and pleasures. If you're really there, I whispered, voicing the last, most vulnerable fear that had been building for weeks, and if you really care about a relationship with me, then I need you to show me what actually brings you joy. Because I am so tired of guessing. I am tired of performing. I am tired of trying to earn something I might already have, or trying to do something you might not even want. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that my raw, honest question about God's pleasure was about to be answered in the most shocking and transformative way imaginable. Because at exactly midnight, the atmosphere in that monastery garden began to shift. It was a change so subtle at first, yet so profound, that it would forever alter my understanding of what God values. The air itself seemed to grow thicker, more alive, charged with a palpable presence. It was a presence so full of unadulterated joy and pure delight that my decades of performance anxiety began to dissolve before a single word was spoken. The temperature didn't change, but reality itself felt more vivid, more intense, as if the veil between worlds was thinning. I knew with a certainty that transcended logic that I was about to receive something that would heal not just my confusion, but my entire approach to spiritual life. And then, sitting on the stone bench beside me, as naturally and as comfortably as if he had been there all along, was God the Father. Not the stern, demanding, performance-focused deity of my religious imagination, but the loving, joyful Father who, I was beginning to understand, had been delighting in me in ways I had never perceived. His presence filled that desert garden with such an overwhelming, infectious joy that all my anxiety about pleasing him seemed suddenly, laughably absurd. He was looking at me, and his eyes held both an infinite, unconditional love and something I can only describe as divine enjoyment, as if my very existence, my very being, brought him a pleasure I had never conceived of. "Jonathan," he said, and his voice was a paradox. It carried the undeniable authority of absolute truth, the very sound that had spoken galaxies into being, yet it was imbued with the intimate warmth of a parent who had been waiting years for this specific conversation. "Thank you for finally asking what I actually enjoy, instead of continuing to assume what I require. Now, I can show you what pleases me most." He paused, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "And I promise you, it's going to shock you, because it is so much simpler and more delightful than anything you have been trying to do." I could barely speak. My throat was tight with a mixture of awe and disbelief, but I managed to whisper the question that had driven me into the desert. "Father, what actually brings you pleasure? What do you enjoy about your relationship with your children?" His expression radiated such perfect, unadulterated delight that I felt I was seeing the true nature of God for the very first time. "My beloved son," he began, "what pleases me most isn't your performance. It's your presence. It's not what you do for me. It's who you are with me. And once you truly understand this, everything about your spiritual life will transform from obligation into invitation, from effort into enjoyment." He settled back on that stone bench, the creator of the universe making himself comfortable beside me, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was about to receive the most important education about God's heart I would ever get. "Are you ready to learn what actually brings me joy?" he asked, his eyes sparkling. "Because once you understand this, you will never again exhaust yourself trying to earn what I am already so eager to give. And you will discover that pleasing me is far more wonderful and far less difficult than you ever imagined." God settled on that stone bench in the monastery garden, and his presence transformed the desert night into what felt like the most sacred classroom in history. The performance anxiety that had been crushing my soul for years began to lift, to evaporate in the warmth of his delight, as I realized I was about to discover what actually brought joy to the heart of the universe. "The first thing you need to understand about what pleases me," he began, his voice filled with the kind of delighted anticipation of someone excited to share wonderful news, "is that it has almost nothing to do with what most religious systems have taught you. What brings me the greatest joy isn't your spiritual performance, it's your authentic presence with me." I felt something fundamental, a tectonic plate in my soul, shifting as he continued. "Think of it this way," he said. "When a parent watches their young child play in a park, what truly brings them joy? Is it the child's rigid attempt to impress them with perfect behavior, following every rule to the letter? Or is it simply delighting in who that child is, how they run, how they laugh, how they discover the world, how they exist in their own unique, authentic personality? That is what pleases me about you, Jonathan. Not your strenuous efforts to be perfect, but your simple willingness to be real with me." This single idea was already a direct challenge to everything I had ever believed about what God valued. For my entire life, I had been trying to impress him, when all he ever wanted was to simply enjoy me. The second truth about what pleases me most, God said, his eyes twinkling with a divine, joyful light, is when my children stop performing and start playing. He paused to let that sink in. I created you for relationship, not for religion. What delights me is when you approach our time together not as work to be done, a duty to be fulfilled, but as joy to be experienced. He gestured to the monastery garden, its desert flora beautiful and serene in the moonlight. Look at this garden. Did the monks who designed it create it to impress me with their horticultural skills, or to create a space where they could enjoy my presence? The beauty here reflects hearts that understand the profound difference between serving out of duty and creating out of love. What pleases me is when your service becomes a celebration, when your duty becomes a delight. The third truth he shared went even deeper, striking at the very root of my anxiety. What brings me enormous pleasure, he said, his tone becoming incredibly gentle, is when my children finally understand that I am not difficult to please. In fact, for those who are in me, I am impossible to displease. You have been carrying this immense anxiety about maintaining my approval, when my approval of you was settled and sealed before you were even born. You cannot lose what was never conditional to begin with. This hit me like a bolt of lightning. My entire spiritual framework was built on the assumption that God's pleasure in me was a fluctuating variable, rising and falling based on my daily performance. He was telling me his delight in me was unconditional, a permanent state. When you portrayed my son speaking about rest, he continued, a hint of gentle amusement in his voice, you were conveying a truth your mind understood, but your heart had not yet received. My yoke really is easy, and my burden really is light. But it is only easy and light when you understand that pleasing me isn't about carrying a weight for me. It's about sharing a joy with me. The fourth truth was revolutionary for a man who had always tried to appear strong. What pleases me most is when my children bring me their questions instead of their conclusions, their doubts instead of their certainty, their struggles instead of their victories. You think I want evidence of your strength, but what truly delights me is your trust in my strength, demonstrated through your weakness. I thought immediately about how I had been hiding my spiritual confusion from God, trying to approach him with polished answers rather than raw questions, with a facade of strength rather than an admission of vulnerability. The conversation you are having with me right now, he explained. This desperate, honest admission of not understanding how to please me this single moment brings me far more joy than years of your disciplined prayers that came from a place of obligation rather than authentic relationship. I don't want your spiritual performance. I want your authentic heart. The fifth truth shocked me completely, for it seemed to contradict so much of what I thought spirituality meant. What pleases me enormously, he said, is when my children enjoy the things I've created, simply because I created them for their enjoyment. You have been taught that spirituality often means denying pleasure, but I tell you that true spirituality means recognizing that I am the source of all genuine pleasure. God stood up and pointed to the sea of stars blazing across the New Mexico sky. I created beauty to be enjoyed. I created music to be delighted in, food to be savored, relationships to be treasured, laughter to be shared. When you experience pure joy in my gifts, you are not being unspiritual. You are pleasing me by gratefully receiving what I have lovingly given. This was the complete opposite of the spiritual framework I'd been operating from, where I had subconsciously believed that earthly pleasures were somehow competing with God for my affection. He was saying that pleasure, when received with gratitude, could be a form of worship. The sixth truth about what pleases me, he said, returning to sit beside me, is when my children stop trying to figure me out and start simply trusting me to reveal myself. You have been exhausting yourself with theological study, trying to understand me intellectually, but what brings me joy is when you receive me relationally. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to comprehend God's nature through books and lectures, rather than simply experiencing his presence through a living relationship. Your portrayal of my son has been so effective, he continued, precisely because you have approached it through relationship, not just through research. The same is true for your own spiritual life. I am not a theological problem to be solved. I am a person to be known. The seventh truth went to the heart of my anxiety. What pleases me immensely is when my children finally understand that I am not keeping score. You operate as if I am in heaven with a divine ledger, tracking your prayers, measuring your service, evaluating your spiritual growth. But I am not grading your performance. I am enjoying your presence. This was liberating beyond words. I had been living my life under the constant, crushing pressure of divine evaluation when he was simply delighting in our relationship. The eighth truth about what pleases me most, God said, his voice becoming even more tender, is when my children bring me their real selves instead of their carefully constructed spiritual personas. You have been trying to please me with who you think you should be, rather than trusting me to love who you actually are. Tears began to well in my eyes as I realized how much energy I had squandered, trying to be the idealized version of myself I thought God wanted, rather than trusting him to enjoy the unique individual he had actually created. Jonathan, he said with infinite gentleness, I don't want the spiritual performance of the man you think I require. I want the authentic relationship with the man I created. Your real personality, your genuine questions, your honest struggles, your natural responses, all of it delights me more than any spiritual facade you could ever construct. The ninth truth was perhaps the most shocking of all. What brings me the greatest pleasure is when my children realize that I am more interested in their happiness than their holiness. This is because I understand that true holiness flows from a secure happiness in my love, not from an anxious striving for my approval. This challenged everything I had ever been taught about spiritual priorities. I had always thought God wanted me to choose holiness over happiness. He was saying that happiness in him was the very foundation of authentic holiness. You have been trying to become holy enough to finally be happy, he explained. But I want you to be happy enough in my love to become naturally holy. Joy in a relationship with me transforms character in ways that duty never could. The 10th and final truth was the key that unlocked everything else. What pleases me most, Jonathan, he said, looking directly into my soul, is simply being enjoyed by my children. Not being obeyed out of fear, not being served out of duty, not being worshipped out of obligation, but being enjoyed out of love. When you find joy in who I am, when you delight in our relationship, when you approach me with anticipation rather than anxiety, that is when my heart is most full. God reached out and placed a hand over my heart. In that instant, it was as if a veil was lifted, and I could feel what he felt when he looked at me. It wasn't evaluation or judgment or measurement. It was pure, overwhelming, unmitigated delight in my existence. Profound joy in who I was, exactly as I was. Absolute pleasure in the simple opportunity to share a relationship with me. The reason most Christians are spiritually exhausted, he said, and his voice was so full of love that I felt decades of misunderstanding dissolve, is because they are trying to earn what I am eager to give. They are working for what I want to share freely. They are performing for someone who just wants to play with them. The garden fell silent as this cascade of truth washed over me, cleansing decades of performance-based spirituality. I wasn't just hearing words. I was experiencing the living reality of a divine pleasure that had nothing to do with my efforts and everything to do with his boundless love. But what about sin? I asked, my logical mind still trying to reconcile this with God's holiness. What about spiritual growth? What about the disciplines? Serving others? God smiled with the warmth of someone about to give me the most practical wisdom of my life. All of those things flow naturally from understanding how much I enjoy you, he explained, not from trying to become someone I could enjoy. When you know how delighted I am in a relationship with you, sin becomes less appealing because it interrupts that shared joy. Growth becomes natural because love always wants to grow closer. Spiritual disciplines transform into delightful activities because they become ways to spend time with someone you love. He gestured around the monastery, where monks had been seeking him for decades. The brothers here who have found real joy in their spiritual life aren't the ones trying the hardest to please me. They are the ones who have discovered how much I enjoy them. Their prayers flow from delight, not duty. Their service flows from love, not law. As God's form began to fade slightly, a gentle signal that our sacred conversation was nearing its end, he left me with the most transformative truth of all. Jonathan, stop trying to please me and start letting me enjoy you. Stop working for my approval and start resting in my delight. Stop earning a relationship and start simply receiving it. Because what pleases me most is when my children finally understand that they don't have to be anything other than who I created them to be to bring me complete and utter joy. His final words came with the authority of absolute, perfect love. Remember this encounter. There are millions of my children exhausting themselves, trying to please me through performance, when what would please me most is for them to simply enjoy being loved by me. They need to know that I am not hard to please. I am impossible to displease when they understand that my pleasure in them isn't based on their efforts, but on my unchanging character. As his presence began to recede from that monastery garden, I felt like a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back his entire life, trying to please an impossible taskmaster, and had suddenly discovered I was actually the beloved child of the most delighted Father in the universe. The performance anxiety that had been suffocating my spiritual life was completely and utterly gone, replaced by a profound sense of joy and freedom I had never experienced in all my years as a Christian. "Thank you," I whispered as his form became translucent in the starlight. "Thank you for showing me that you're not hard to please. You're impossible to displease when I understand that your joy in me isn't based on my performance." His final words came like a gentle benediction on the desert air. "Remember this joy, Jonathan. Every person who sees you living in the freedom of being enjoyed by me will want to know how that freedom is possible. Your transformation from performance to presence will become their invitation to discover what actually pleases me." And then he was gone. I was alone again on the stone bench in that desert garden, but everything was different. I was left with the most liberating, life-altering understanding of God's heart I had ever received. But this wasn't just a fleeting emotional relief. It was a foundational truth that demanded to be lived out in every single aspect of my life. The very first thing I did was something I had never done in a spiritual context before. I laughed. I laughed out loud. A deep, booming laugh of pure joy that echoed under those New Mexico stars. I laughed at the beautiful absurdity of how hard I had been working to earn something that was already mine, freely given through love. For a full 20 minutes, I sat on that stone bench and did nothing but enjoy being enjoyed by God, marveling at how profoundly different his divine pleasure felt from the fickle, conditional approval of humans. This wasn't the relief of a performer after a good show. This was the authentic celebration of discovering that the God of the universe found delight in my existence, exactly as I was. The next morning, I participated in morning prayers with the monks, but the experience was completely transformed. Instead of trying to pray impressively or sound spiritual, I simply talked with God as one would talk to a beloved friend who I knew loved spending time with me. Instead of reciting perfect, hollow words, I shared my honest, messy thoughts. Instead of performing worship, I simply enjoyed the relationship. Brother Thomas, the wise old monk who had been leading the prayer sessions, noticed the change immediately. After the service, he approached me. "Jonathan," he said, his brow furrowed in gentle curiosity, "there is something different about your presence in prayer today. You seem more present, if that makes sense. Less like you are trying to accomplish something, and more like you are simply enjoying being here." I took a deep breath and shared what had happened in the garden, the night before my desperate prayer, my encounter with God, his shocking revelations about what pleases him most, and the profound transformation from performance anxiety to the joy of presence. Brother Thomas listened with growing amazement, and as I spoke, a look of profound relief washed over his weathered face. "In my 50 years of monastic life," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have seen countless souls exhaust themselves trying to please God through spiritual effort. What you have discovered is the great secret of the mystics. God is far more interested in being enjoyed than in being impressed. But most people never learn this because they are too busy trying to earn what is already freely given." We talked for hours that morning about the critical difference between spiritual performance and spiritual presence, between earning God's pleasure and simply receiving it, between approaching God as a demanding boss versus a delighted father. Brother Thomas shared that the most genuinely joyful monks he had ever known were not the most disciplined or the most ascetic, but those who had discovered this same truth. "The brothers who pray with real joy," he explained, "are not the ones trying hardest to be holy. They are the ones who have learned that God enjoys their company exactly as they are. Their disciplines flow from love, not from law. Their service flows from delight, not from duty." That afternoon, I did something that would have terrified the old me. I spent 2 hours in the garden doing absolutely nothing spiritual. I didn't pray formally. I didn't read scripture. I didn't meditate on deep theological concepts. I simply sat in the warm New Mexico sunshine, watched the clouds drift across the vast desert sky, and marveled at the simple fact of being enjoyed by the creator of everything I was experiencing. It felt more spiritually nourishing than years of disciplined devotional time that had been motivated by obligation rather than a desire for relationship. When I returned to the chosen set 3 days later, the transformation was immediately evident to everyone who knew me well. My entire approach to portraying Jesus had shifted. I was no longer trying to represent him perfectly. I was simply enjoying being in relationship with him during each scene. Elizabeth Tabish, who plays Mary Magdalene, was the first to comment. "Jonathan, something's different about your energy," she said, her eyes searching mine. "You seem more peaceful, lighter, like you're not carrying some invisible weight you used to carry. What happened in New Mexico?" I shared my story, my encounter with God, and his message about what actually pleases him, that he enjoys our presence more than our performance. Her response was one of immediate, palpable recognition. "I've been exhausting myself trying to please God through perfect behavior," she said with obvious relief. "What you're describing, it sounds like permission to actually enjoy being his daughter instead of constantly working to earn his approval." George Xanthus, who plays John, overheard our conversation and joined in with his own vulnerability. "I've always felt like God was constantly evaluating my spiritual progress, like I was on a cosmic report card and never quite measuring up to what he expected. The idea that he's actually delighted in me, exactly as I am, that's revolutionary." Dallas Jenkins noticed the change when we began filming later that week. We were shooting scenes where Jesus talks about finding rest in his relationship with the Father, about the joy of divine fellowship, about approaching God with the confidence of a beloved child, rather than the fear of a servant. "That is the most authentic portrayal of Jesus' joy in the Father I have ever seen," Dallas said, after we wrapped a particularly emotional scene. "It didn't look like acting. It looked like someone who genuinely understands what it feels like to be enjoyed by God, rather than evaluated by him." This transformation wasn't just professional, it was permeating every area of my life. My personal prayer time became something I looked forward to with eagerness, rather than something I felt obligated to complete. Reading scripture became a rich conversation with someone I loved, rather than homework for a demanding teacher. Service became a joyful celebration, not a grim duty. Even my approach to moral choices shifted. It was no longer about avoiding God's displeasure, but about protecting the precious joy of our shared relationship. 2 weeks after my encounter, I received an invitation that demonstrated just how quickly this internal spiritual transformation affects external opportunities. A major Christian conference asked me to speak, but they didn't ask me to talk about acting or about the chosen. They asked me to speak specifically about joy, the spiritual life, and what it truly means to please God. "Jonathan," the conference director said during our planning call, "there's something different about how you talk about God lately. You sound less like someone who's trying to be a good Christian and more like someone who actually enjoys being a Christian. We want you to share whatever it is you've discovered about finding joy in faith." That speaking engagement became one of the most impactful presentations I have ever given. Not because of any eloquent delivery or profound theological depth on my part, but because I was sharing from the fresh, raw experience of God's delight, rather than trying to teach concepts I didn't fully live. For years, I told the audience of 2,000 pastors and ministry leaders I was exhausting myself trying to please God through spiritual performance. But 8 weeks ago, he shocked me by revealing that what pleases him most isn't my effort to impress him. It's my willingness to be enjoyed by him. The response was overwhelming. During the break, dozens of leaders approached me, their own stories tumbling out, stories of their struggles with performance-based spirituality, their exhaustion from trying to earn God's approval, their profound relief at hearing they had permission to simply be enjoyed by God, rather than constantly evaluated by him. "I've been in ministry for 30 years, said a pastor named Rebecca Martinez, her eyes filled with tears, "and I have never heard anyone talk about pleasing God through presence rather than performance. This changes everything about how I understand my own spiritual life and how I will lead my congregation." Dr. James Patterson, a seminary professor, was visibly moved. "I've taught theology for 25 years, he shared, "but what you've shared today is more transformative than any doctrinal concept I've ever learned. The idea that God enjoys our company more than our compliance, that's revolutionary." 3 months after my encounter, word had spread. I began receiving invitations from other actors, directors, and producers in the Christian entertainment industry who were struggling with the immense pressure of trying to represent faith perfectly while battling their own deep spiritual insecurities. "Jonathan," said one actor who had been cast in several faith-based films, I am so exhausted from trying to be worthy of representing Christian values on screen. Your story about discovering God's delight in you exactly as you are, that's what I need to hear. How do I stop performing Christianity and start enjoying it? These conversations blossomed into informal mentoring relationships with dozens of people who were discovering that authentic joy in God's love was far more attractive and compelling to audiences than sterile spiritual performance. 1 year after that night in the desert, I received a message that demonstrated the incredible ripple effect of this transformation. A seminary student wrote to me, sharing that my conference presentation had completely changed his approach to ministry preparation. I was burning out trying to become worthy of serving God, he wrote. Your explanation that God enjoys our presence more than our performance saved my calling. I'm learning to approach ministry from a place of joy rather than duty, and it's transforming how I connect with people about faith. But the most profound validation came during a conversation with Father Miguel Rodriguez, the very priest whose gentle, probing question had started my spiritual crisis. When I met with him and shared what God had revealed in the monastery garden, Father Miguel smiled a wide, radiant smile of pure joy, the smile of someone hearing a familiar and beloved truth. Jonathan, he said with obvious delight, you have discovered what I have been trying to teach for 50 years. The Christians who truly impact the world are not those who are trying the hardest to please God. They are those who have learned to be pleased by God. Their joy becomes an irresistible invitation to a world that is exhausted by religious performance. Now, almost 2 years after my encounter with God, I regularly speak to audiences around the world about the life-changing difference between spiritual performance and spiritual presence. The 10 truths God shared with me in that sacred garden have become the foundation for everything I teach about an authentic relationship with Him. Maybe you are listening to this right now and you recognize yourself in my story. Maybe you too have been exhausting yourself, trying to please God through relentless spiritual effort, moral perfectionism, a flurry of religious activities, or success in ministry. Maybe you live with that same constant low-grade anxiety about whether you're doing enough, being enough, or growing enough to maintain God's approval. Maybe your prayers feel like reports to a demanding boss. Maybe you read scripture like you're studying for a difficult test, or you serve others out of a sense of joyless duty. Maybe you've been trying to become worthy of God's love instead of simply and freely receiving it. If that is you, I want you to hear this loud and clear. What pleases God most will shock you, because it is so much simpler and more joyful than anything you have been trying to do. You do not have to earn His delight. You already have it. You do not have to perform for His approval. You already possess it. The 10 truths God taught me have the power to transform any performance-based spirituality into a presence-based relationship. First, what pleases God most is your authentic presence, not your spiritual performance. He wants your real self, not your religious persona. Second, what brings God joy is when you stop performing and start playing. When you approach your relationship with Him as a joy to be experienced, not a work to be done. Third, God is impossible to displease when you understand that His pleasure in you isn't conditional on your performance but is permanently established through His character. Fourth, what pleases God most is when you bring Him your questions instead of your conclusions, your struggles instead of your victories, your weakness instead of your strength. Fifth, God is pleased when you enjoy the gifts He's created for your enjoyment, recognizing that genuine pleasure can be a form of worship. Sixth, what brings God joy is when you stop trying to figure Him out intellectually and start experiencing Him relationally. Seventh, God is not keeping score of your spiritual performance. He is simply enjoying your presence and delighting in His relationship with you. Eighth, what pleases God most is when you bring Him your real self instead of who you think you should be, trusting Him to love the person He actually created. Ninth, God is more interested in your happiness and His love than your anxious striving for holiness, because secure happiness is what produces authentic holiness naturally. And 10th, what pleases God most is simply being enjoyed by His children, approached with anticipation rather than anxiety, loved rather than feared, delighted in rather than merely obeyed. If you are someone who has been trapped in the prison of spiritual performance anxiety, please understand that God is not hard to please. He is impossible to displease when you know His pleasure comes from His character, not your performance. You do not have to become anything other than who He created you to be to bring Him complete joy. You don't have to earn what He is so eager to give. You don't have to work for what He wants to share freely. Father God, I thank you for the revelation that transformed my understanding of what actually pleases you and freed me from decades of spiritual performance anxiety. For every single person listening who has been exhausting themselves trying to earn your approval, I pray that they would receive this same radical freedom that comes from understanding you are impossible to displease. For those who approach you with anxiety rather than anticipation, help them discover that you enjoy their company exactly as they are. For those who treat the spiritual life as work rather than a relationship, help them learn to play with you rather than perform for you. For those who carry the heavy weight of trying to become worthy of your love, help them simply receive the love that makes them worthy. For those who are constantly measuring their spiritual progress, help them rest in your delight, which isn't based on their efforts. Help all of us to stop trying to please you and to start letting you enjoy us. Help us to approach you as beloved children rather than anxious employees, as friends rather than subjects, as people you delight in rather than people you are constantly evaluating. Thank you for loving us, not because we are perfect, but because love is who you are. Thank you for showing us that what pleases you most is infinitely simpler and more joyful than we ever imagined. In Jesus' name, Amen. The truth I learned in that New Mexico monastery garden is the truth that can transform any spiritual life from performance to presence. What pleases God most isn't your effort to impress Him. It is your willingness to be enjoyed by Him. You don't have to earn divine approval. You can simply receive divine delight. God isn't keeping score of your spiritual performance. He is not evaluating your progress. He is not measuring your efforts. He is enjoying your existence, delighting in your personality, and celebrating your presence in His life. You are already pleasing to God, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. His pleasure in you is settled, permanent, and impossible to lose. Thank you for letting me share the most shocking and liberating discovery about God's heart I have ever received. I love you all, and God loves you enough to be completely delighted in you, exactly as you are.